Good afternoon. My name is Margie Dirks Peterson, and I'm Fountain Street's chaplain. I want to welcome you to this celebration of Werner Veit, an extraordinary human being who called Fountain Street Church home. His family appreciates your presence and invites you to join them in the social hall, out the rear doors and to your left after the service, to share your reminiscences of Werner with them and with each other. Werner chose Fountain Street as his spiritual home. Fountain Street represents freedom of thought in the Grand Rapids community. All who enter these doors are welcome here in the spirit of open-minded love and the ability to disagree without animosity. These elements appealed to Werner, who had been a member here since his wedding on December 24 of 1958. His dedication to the church included teaching in the character school, being an usher, and in fact, being the head usher for many years. His contributions to the church were myriad, and his energy and dedication to this institution and to the world, like ripples, continue on for eternity. And now, with these words, I invite you to join me in this lovely space. We gather today to acknowledge the impermanence of the body and the eternity of spirit. We come together to release our hold on who Werner was and begin to see our way of becoming in a world without his physical presence. We recognize the necessity for mourning and accept the support of this loving community. Welcome to this celebration of the life of Werner Veit.
Hi, I'm Tony. Like my mom and dad, I've always loved Fountain Street Church's amazing sanctuary, especially when the sun, when it does, peeks through the big rose window. And the wonderful organ music, too. Thank you, Marilyn. I grew up in this church, hanging out on this stage for junior choir, weddings, and funerals. Thanks, Margie, for those words welcoming us all. Thank you all for being here to remember Werner. As Andy and Tammy will mention, Werner's life adventures would make a screenplay for a movie. Escaping Nazi Germany at age 8, sailing to Bogota, Colombia, where he was schooled and played soccer with Jesuit priests. In 1940, he was in high school age. He and his parents emigrated to the US, eventually settling in Michigan, with none of them speaking English. After high school and a stint in the Army, he started a long newspaper career, first as a sports reporter for the Grand Rapids Herald, as an editor for the Grand Rapids Press, and then its publisher, and eventually as president of all 8 Booth newspapers. Werner was always working, and sometimes that meant we had to work too. In fact, my sister Tammy and I learned our fractions by transcribing the stock market tables for the next day's newspaper. On the upside, we also got to help pick out the comics that would run on Sunday. Later in my career, I had Werner as my boss, joined his kiddie corps, and although there were advantages, he set high standards. Werner taught us many things about life and work, sometimes through his quotes, such as, when us kids would complain about a situation, he would say, "Whoever told you life was fair?" When it was important to assert ourselves, he who tooteth not his own horn, that horn tooteth not. When we question an assignment, usually from him, of course you have a choice. You can either choose to do it, or you can damn well better do it. And he emphasized the importance of listening carefully, even though when he did it, it often looked like napping. Werner and Marianne make Lake Michigan and its beaches a constant part of our family traditions. Water and sand are in the background of all family photos since Tammy, Andy, and I were babies. Even before his long term as president of the North Country Trail Association, Werner introduced us to walking in the woods. He used to hike with us through what is now Rosie Mound Natural Area, long before there were stairs and benches. Werner and Marianne loved to travel too, whether to visit libraries across the country or hike trails in England, France, Italy, or wherever their nomads travel group flew. Their numerous photo albums inspired all us kids to travel. Werner's devotion to Marianne was extraordinary as he had to spend more and more time caring for her. Fortunately, in the last few years, her home aide, Kim, was a wonderful help and relief to our family. As our mother's health further declined, Werner gave up his favorite pursuits and became her 7x24 caregiver. We were fortunate to again have Kim's help in that caregiving. After Marianne passed and Werner's own health declined, Kim stayed on as his constant caregiver. Thank you, Kim. I am indeed thankful for the life my dad gave me and for establishing the traditions and values that Nancy and I will continue through the next generation with my daughters Whitney and Tori and my sometimes noisy grandchildren. Thanks again for being here with us today. And now some words from my sister Tammy.
Hi. My dad was always one of the few Democrats in Kent County. I didn't even know what that meant until I was in about the 5th grade, and it was an election year. The teachers asked us that first Tuesday in November to vote with our hands, as we thought our parents would be voting that day. Most hands went up for the Republicans. Then it was me, and maybe one other hand went up. That went right over my head. But at recess, the kids came up to me and said, "What's wrong with your parents, Veit?" I was still pretty clueless about politics for many years until I met a guy named Peter Secchia in my late teens. He was a well-known businessman with an interest in restaurants when he basically asked me the same question: "What's wrong with your old man, Tammy?" That got a little tiring. So my dad and I butted heads for a number of years. Talk about strict. I got a B+ once in high school. So he started walking around the house saying, "It'll be nice having you around another year, Tam. You know, you'll be enjoying Grand Rapids Junior College." "No way, Jose," I said to myself. "I am out of this jail and lame town." Needless to say, I got no more B's and I was on my way to Ann Arbor. I rarely asked him to edit my papers because I couldn't have handled the withering comments, but he did tell me once to try and write like Ernest Hemingway. Less is always more. Of course, I wanted to please him, so I figured the best way was to jump out of an airplane. I sent him my first flight certificate from Tecumseh Airport as a freshman when friends and I decided to train for 6 hours to be given the opportunity to push ourselves out the door at 10,000 feet up in the air. He wrote me back immediately, "Tam, you might not be a chip off the old block, but you sure are a step off the static line. Love, Dad." He also taught us how to downhill ski, embrace any kind of travel, and to salute whenever we drove by the Grand Rapids Press building. With few words, we understood that our main job was to do well in school and work as hard as it took. There were no slackers at our house. And I only just recently learned the most amazing thing about him. With his love for education and generosity to people trying to better themselves, he never graduated from college. That still stuns me to this day because he turned out to be such an amazing product of everything he studied his whole life.
Thanks everyone for coming. And a special thank you to our organist, Marilyn. My mom and dad were super fans, and I'm sure the most important part of this service for him is the music. So many thank yous. I want to share with you today one of my favorite anecdotes about my dad. But first, a bit of backstory. By his own account, Werner had an idyllic early childhood. He was an only child, and he lived with his parents in an apartment above a shop outside Stuttgart, near his mother's family vineyard, where he claimed to stomp grapes during harvest. His father sold newspaper advertising, among other things. His mother took in sewing. She played the piano and promised him if he took violin lessons, he would get a concertina, which is an accordion-like instrument, and really just a great visual of Werner playing the concertina. His dad taught him to ski in the hills behind their home. He played soccer with his friends and walked to the neighborhood school until he was about 8 and the Nazis banned all the Jewish kids. They weren't a devout family. His father was Jewish, his mother was not, but education was important, and they sent him to a private Jewish school. His father, Conrad, was a social democrat, which Werner likened to Bernie Sanders today. But he was dangerous enough to the Nazis that they arrested him several times, including once in the middle of the night by brown-clad stormtroopers who beat him and dragged him out of the house while Werner screamed and his mother stood terrified and mute. In the early days of the Nazi regime, a still independent judiciary dismissed the charges against Conrad and he was released. And in the meantime, his mother's family arranged their escape from Germany, as Tony noted, on a Chilean commercial freighter bound for Colombia, South America, where they had bought entry and could live among a small group of German Jewish refugees. The voyage across the Atlantic took about 2 weeks, and it was miserable. The weather was terrible, there was very little accommodation for passengers, and Werner was seasick most of the time. So I try to picture it. He's left his home, his friends, his school, his family, everything familiar. He's witnessed the brutality of the Nazis in his own living room. And now on top of all of that, he's sick. And he turns to his dad, and in a rare moment, he complains. And his father says, and this is the good part, "You're right. For an ordinary boy, this would be difficult." An ordinary boy. Never an ordinary boy was Werner. That sums up everything for me. He was a smart, hardworking, successful man, but mostly he just carried on and mostly made the best of things and frequently found joy. Wasn't it hard moving to South America and going to a Jesuit school when you didn't speak the language and you weren't even Catholic? No, it was a blast. We played soccer with the priests, their cassocks flying. We climbed the wall to spy on the girls next door at the sister school. What about moving to America, with whom Germany was at war? And moving to Grand Rapids, where Jews were rare and maybe even strange. And again, you didn't speak the language. Weren't kids mean to you? No, I loved high school. I had great friends. I wrote school plays and ran the school newspaper. And mostly, he made the best of my mom's long, terrible illness and did extraordinary things to make sure if she wasn't happy or even comfortable, she was loved, always. I don't know where the story about my grandfather on the freighter, I don't know where that came from. I vaguely remember hearing it from my mom, no doubt when I was being obstinately ordinary. Maybe she heard it from my grandparents. But I know I never heard it from my dad, who loved nothing more than a long conversation around a table with good friends and family and great food and great wine, but never, ever talked about the more difficult parts of his journey. So, in fact, when I asked him about it not that long ago, he denied ever hearing the story at all. So maybe it was an urban legend, but I think of it as a tribute. I made up this game with my grandsons. When the sun peeks out through the clouds and the trees and sprinkles the ground around us, we scoop it up in a big armful, and we put it in our pocket to go on about our day with a smile on our step. That is how my dad lived his life. When the many gods of his childhood shone down upon him, he carried that strength with him. He chose happiness over bitterness. My dad was a rigorous thinker, a proud citizen, a thoughtful friend, a loving husband and father and grandfather and great-grandfather, and never, an ordinary man. Thank you.
How does one sum up a life? Werner's life goes on in the spirits of all of those who cared for him and beyond, long beyond. Every life we touch touches so many other lives. Sometimes we think when those we've interacted with directly are gone that we'll be forgotten. But a life such as Werner's that touched so many people will go on forever. In closing, these words from Werner himself. He says, "Like my father, who came to the observance of Jewish high holy days, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, in old age, I have now come to consider spiritual ritual as my living years tick away. For me, that means a different observance, one of the most profound precepts in the Talmud by the prophet Micah, who said to us in chapter 6, verse 8, act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. God, for me, is a metaphor for our conscience as we lead our imperfect lives. Blessed be.